if you will, this is like the seed from which many religious teachings sprang as well, that the original avatars would have understood this as well, that, sexuality, sexual energy wasn't something to be abused. And, if we are abusing our sexuality for the sake of pleasure, that in itself is almost testament to the fact that we are in a fallen state, because it's only when we're in such a fallen state that we would need to seek out these kind of trivial, menial pleasures as if to try to fill some void or to fill something that's lacking. And what we're really lacking, I feel, is this connection to a kind of a higher spiritual state of being, whereby we're so filled with joy and with love for others that sexuality and, overindulgence and especially lustfulness would be like not even worth thinking about. It would be just like laughable how trivial that is compared to what we would have in terms of our being. And so I think that's the message that a lot of the religions try to espouse. Now, I think the trouble comes in whereby, let's say, a lot of priests and clergy and other members of different faiths coming in with a certain level of consciousness, they might have twisted that pure, that pure understanding that does on surface make a lot of sense when you think about it this way, but they would have twisted that in a way to put in, to convey like a lot of shame and guilt and negative emotions like this, and making people feel ashamed for their sexuality and who they are. And I think when it's presented in that light, as the author suggested earlier, he said that this message was kind of mangled and it was given to the lay people, he said, in a way that kind of turned them off it, and I think that's what he's talking about here, that a lot of if we talk about the Catholic Church, if we talk about Christianity especially, but also in Islam and other religions, it's kind of presented in a way that sexuality is like something sinful, and if you indulge in that, then you ought to be ashamed. And I think there is like a little nugget of truth in that, in terms of like in overindulging in it, it will degrade us and it's not in our highest interest. But I think the message wasn't conveyed as effectively as it could, and as a result of that, people also, I think, have the tendency to rebel. And it's almost gotten to a stage now where it's like seen as almost a virtue to just be enslaved to sexual pleasure, because people think that it's like liberal and progressive, and those clergymen, the church, all of that's so antiquated and backwards, and it's so repressive and oppressive. So let's just go into pure hedonism, because obviously that's a good thing, because the opposite was bad. So it's kind of like this reactionary thing where people just go to full hedonism as if to stick up the middle finger to like what they see as the oppressiveness of tradition, when really it's just viewing tradition in the worst light possible, just because a few people might have not conveyed these teachings effectively. If you look to tradition, there's a reason that all of these traditions were in place. They're, in essence, these practices like, sexual purity, having sex in marriage, the institution of marriage itself, the family unit, all of this. That's not there to oppress people and to make their lives miserable. It might seem that way in our current liberal zeitgeist, but in essence, the reason all of those practices were in place, not just in Western society and European societies, but through all cultures, tribal cultures, indigenous cultures, Asia, the Americas, Africa, all of this, it's because these practices, when instilled in the community, they're conducive to collective good as opposed to individual good, and that's like what I was talking about earlier in the video, that we've kind of gone into this hyper individualist mode today, and it's all about hedonism and self-service, and that is actually against nature. It's actually not the natural order of things. We are, just like we're embedded in ecosystems, just like we're embedded in Gaia as a whole, which is a holistic living system, so also are we naturally embedded in communities and generally also in ethnicities, in cultures that tend to overlap with ethnicity, and so on and so forth. And that tends to be the natural order of things as well, that we are part of a community, we're part of a greater whole. And it's only in the last 100 years or so that we kind of have this license to literally indulge in any pleasure or hedonistic pursuit that we wish, and have the illusion that it's not impacting the greater whole as well. But that's only an illusion. The truth is that even now, in this like hyper-liberal society, for any individual to engage in hedonism, it inevitably damages the greater whole, you know. And the opposite is true. When we return to virtue, when we return to holding higher ideals in mind and striving towards that spiritual joy instead of the kind of base pleasure, you know, when we strive for those higher ideals, that benefits all of the whole as well, and it kind of ripples outwards into the world, and into our community. So that's kind of the power that we have. And I really feel that sexuality and sexual energy is incredibly potent, and it's at the crux of this, you know. I think for both men and women, but I think for men in one sense particularly so, because some of it is due to the nature of male sexuality, that the sexuality of the male, it tends more towards depletion in terms of, you know, ejaculation, that when a man ejaculates, he's kind of depleted, and it's like there's something lost. I think that occurs with the woman in orgasm also, but not quite to the same extent as men. And I made a video about this on the channel, one of the earlier videos, I think the relationship between man and woman and their sexual and spiritual advantages, it was called. I talked about how it's almost like, and I know this is controversial to say, especially today, but I think that the man kind of, and men as a collective, we set the rhythm in terms of sexuality. And in essence, like, a lot of the burden is on our shoulders, that society has fallen to such an extent. I think a lot of that rests with men, because men are kind of the instigators sexually as well, and like we are more prone to be like, I think we're more prone to succumb to lust. And I think that then has a knock-on effect on women, that women kind of reflect back to men their, like, men's own state. So I think when men enter a fallen state, women follow, you know. Like there's a saying that I tend to believe in, it's God in Christ, Christ in man, man over woman, woman over children. So I view it that the man sets the tone in terms of his values, his morality, and the woman benefits from that. When the man is in a spiritual ideal state, the woman benefits from that. And if the man falls, the woman falls with him. And in turn, I think it's the woman's role then to guide the children. Of course, the man is offering guidance to the children too, but I think it's more the woman's role to guide the children, to nourish them, to nurture them, to love them, and all of that. So that's the forward. I'll just check. Okay. I think I'll read just the first chapter as well. So another quote. In order to reconstruct society, we must reconstruct the moral ideal. So this is what we're talking about here, the moral ideal. We need to strive towards a higher moral value. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard because we're presently in a fallen state as a species, especially sexually. Part 1. Formulating the ideal. For the remoralization of sex, which is so long overdue, we need a more definite turning to higher ideals. That's another quote. Another quote. Heaven and earth were once united, but were severed by a serpent. I think that's a really interesting quote because I guess it's a reference to the Garden of Eden, which I've spoken about on the channel. I've recently made a video, perhaps that will already be uploaded by the time this goes live, where I'm actually talking about the Garden of Eden and what I think it means. And I'm mostly focused on humanity's diet and dietary history, evolutionary history, and how that ties in with the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. But I think it's interesting this here as well, like I didn't think to bring in this element of how it could also be to do with sexuality, because of course the serpent has always been a symbol of like the phallus in ancient and indigenous cultures. It's always been associated with male vitality and sexuality. So I think it's interesting to note as well, you know, how that could tie in with the serpent in the Garden of Eden and tempting Eve. I don't know what the symbolism of tempting Eve is, but regardless, it tempted Adam and Eve, and after that there was a fall. So I think that's definitely representative of what humanity's gone through with its sexuality as well, succumbing to lust. So chapter 1, the serpent, another quote: "A serpent twisted in spiral volumes is the hieroglyphic of evil." Okay. Caught in the mighty coils of the giant serpent, sex, humanity is on the point of being crushed and strangled. That serpent, which in the beginning was intended to serve human evolution, was foolishly adopted as a pet and unduly coaxed and fondled. Being overfed and pampered and having its slightest whims complied with, the pet has grown into a monster that has overpowered its master and now threatens to destroy him. Out of the choking throat of imperiled humanity, the inner ear can hear a cry for help ascending, a fearful cry that swells and falls and again rises, pleading for liberation from the malignant creature's rigid hold. But there is no response, no outside help forthcoming. Man's precarious position is entirely self-produced. He himself it was who gave the creature all the power it now has by his habitual yielding to its growing demands, and he himself must remedy this self-created woe by unrelenting self-exertion. The serpent is the monster to be overcome. If man but wills, he can reduce its power. He can brace himself against the pressure of the uncanny coils. He can in fact subdue the unwieldy and unruly reptile, even yet by opposing its depraved desires. By will, he can reduce it to servility again, and then its valuable hidden power will aid him in his ascent of evolution's path. Indeed, when conquered, the serpent becomes a means of life. Instead of appropriating the life force of man, it will then supply him with the greatest factor that can lead to a higher human existence. The turbulent serpent of sex will then be transformed into the docile serpent of wisdom, which will show the way out of the human toward the superhuman state. But man must not delay. He must unloose the coils before the monster crushes him. The symbol of a snake encoiling the body of humanity occurs in the mythology of various peoples. And Oriental literature mentions a serpent coiled up in a mysterious center of force inside the human body. So that would be the Kundalini. While the two are not entirely equivalent, the uncoiling of this serpent within the body, as of the entwining monster, is held to be man's evolutionary task. Records of a serpent symbolism in some form or another have been found in all parts of the world. Especially of universal occurrence are the legends about heroes who conquer an evil serpent, and there can be no doubt that these legends symbolize the necessity of man's victory over the domineering influence of sex, for from the earliest times folklore seems to have connected the serpent with the sexual function. Erudite investigators have come to the conclusion that the serpent always has a phallic signification. But what usually mystifies the student of symbolism is that through the serpent is exhibited as the representative of the evil principle, it is considered also in the opposite light. However, where the symbolism has not suffered in transition, there is a notable difference between the two portrayals. While the evil serpent is coiled, the serpent of good is always represented as upright. This is the transformed serpent, not anymore coiled but standing on its tail, its body slightly curved, reminiscent of the human spine, which plays such an important part in the actual uncoiling of the serpent. It is still the phallic serpent, but conquered, tamed, and thereby changed into the most valuable adjunct of man. Reflective inquiry into various forms of serpent symbolism shows that they contain a principle of supreme importance, namely that every effort to resist the demands of the sexual urge will gradually lead to an uncoiling of the serpent and therewith to spiritual freedom and untrammeled evolutionary growth. But this ultimate result cannot be attained without a conscious realization of ideal purification. Tremendous purity is the one secret of spirituality, of that factor of evolutionary attainment which must follow the acquisition of intellect, but which has almost entirely been neglected by mankind. End of chapter. So yeah, I think that's a nice introduction, the symbolism of the serpent, and the author is talking about how the serpent has been symbolized throughout all societies, practically all societies, throughout human history, in different forms and different ways. And he talks about two main ways that it's been represented. One is coiled, and that symbol is associated with evil, or you could say, because evil again, it's something that has a lot of baggage, and I think that's what I was talking about earlier with the church. It's that a lot of these terms and even these lessons, these messages have been conveyed in very negative ways, and it's kind of like they've become charged, emotionally charged, so that when we hear certain words or phrases, it's like our brain shuts down and we just block ourselves off to it. So I think, when we're talking about evil, in this case, what we're talking about is just not reaching our highest potential, being in a fallen state, or being addicted to lower, more base pleasures as opposed to those spiritual joys, as well as the unfolding evolution of humanity that can come with that process. So it's kind of like humanity right now is in a fallen state, and we've temporarily foregone our spiritual evolution. It's like we've kind of stopped by the roadside or the wayside, and we're kind of dawdling around, just indulging in pleasure and indulging in ourselves, and trapped in the world, as it were. Because what is spiritual evolution in essence? It's kind of transcending the physical in a sense. It's evolving up towards higher states of being that are less and less material. And in essence, when we're indulging in sexuality and lustfulness, what we're doing is we're getting trapped in the world. And Jesus Christ spoke about this, be in the world but not of it. And don't lust after the flesh, all of this. Because when you're lusting after the flesh, you're trapped in that materiality, you're trapped in that physicality. And as I was talking about earlier, it's like physicality and spirituality, they're almost, in some senses, they're diametrically opposed. Like I understand some might disagree with that, and I actually would disagree with it in certain circumstances. Like, I understand there's the idea of pantheism, and I am quite sympathetic to that worldview of it's the idea that basically God is everywhere, in all things, in each of us, even in mundane objects, everything that you see around you. Spirit is contained within all matter. I would be very sympathetic to that worldview. But I also think there is some truth in the idea that we can get caught up in the physical to the detriment of our spiritual growth, our spiritual evolution. And that's why I think sexuality is at the root of our spiritual evolution. It's like, because it can either, as he was saying in this chapter, it can either draw us back into the world, or it can be a force to be tamed that can then unlock energy and spiritual faculties within us. So as he was saying, it becomes then the serpent of wisdom, the docile serpent of wisdom. And he was saying this other representation of the serpent is that it's straight, so that the coiled serpent straightens out and it almost becomes like the human spine. And I think that has really interesting symbolic significance as well, because I think the spine is tied in with sexuality. This is talked about in Christian mysticism. So there's talk about the cerebrospinal fluid and the Christ oil. So You could look up videos about that on YouTube, the Christ oil. I might actually talk about that in a future video, but the idea is that when a man retains his seed over time, you see there's a process, and the Vedics in India, they talked about this. In ancient India, they talked about how there's a process that your food gets converted to chyle, which is kind of like semi-digested food, that gets converted to like blood, and that gets converted to this mightn't be exactly it, but it's something like fat and muscle, and then bone marrow, and then the bone marrow, apparently according to the Vedic tradition, is linked in with the semen, that from the refined bone marrow, the semen is refined from that, and that's how it's produced. So what they're saying anyway is that semen is a very precious fluid, and it takes a lot of energy to produce, which I think makes a lot of sense because it's a miraculous fluid. It creates literally a new human being. There's miraculous power in that fluid, and to squander that is, I feel, a calamity, and it's really detrimental for man, and that's what we're waking up to. But Christian mysticism takes it a step further, at least certain teachings, certain strands of Christian mysticism. It's suggested that the semen further gets distilled or purified, and it travels up, it enriches the cerebrospinal fluid, travels up to the brain, and on a physiological level I think this would make some sense, because it would tend to explain a lot of the processes in consciousness that people describe when they take up this practice. That people have described it in terms of the chakras as well, the energy centers of the body that are interestingly located along the spine. And it's like the more you do this practice as a man, the more your consciousness rises up out of states of fear and apathy and lust towards neutrality, and then up towards like courage, confidence, love, spiritual insight, even spiritual discernment, connectedness, all of this. So this would correlate with consciousness rising up through the various chakras along the spine, which would correlate with, if true, these more physiological processes of the seminal fluid being put to use, because it makes sense to me that if the body knows that you're not ejaculating all the time, if you're not squandering that fluid, that it's not just going to sit in your balls, it's going to be reutilized, and it's going to contribute to your revitalization. Instead of creating new life outside, it will help nourish your life within. And I think as part of that process, one possibility that makes a lot of sense to me is this idea of the seminal fluid enriching the cerebrospinal fluid, and then that cerebrospinal fluid is going up to the brain, nourishing the brain with, I don't know, if you want to be very materialistic about it, you could say like extra nutrition. But I think there's more to it than that. There's energetics involved, there's probably spiritual aspects involved that we hardly understand yet. And they even talk about in Christian mysticism of like a consecration that happens on like Pineal Hill. There's even a quote in the Bible about that Pineal Hill. I don't know it exactly, but it's talking about a consecration on Pineal Hill, and that of course links in with the pineal gland, pine cone shaped gland, which is all to do with like your consciousness, spiritual discernment, third eye, seeing truth from falsehood, being awake and aware in the world, and being connected to all that is. So I think semen retention and sexual preservation, it ties in with all of that, and he's laid it out beautifully in this first chapter. So yeah, that's the first chapter. There are a lot of chapters in this book. I'll see if I'll go through them all, or if I'll end up doing like a kind of a general overview once I read the book. But I said I'd make a start anyway and see how it goes. So yeah, let me know if you enjoyed that. You can comment in the chat or in the comments. Let me know your thoughts, if you'd like to see like more of the series, or kind of what format you think would be good, or what else you'd like in terms of content in this topic. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for listening. See you in future videos. Oh, and be sure to give it a like and subscribe as well. Thanks.